I'm Myra. Hey guys, I'm Myra with Atomic Baby Cosplay, and today I'm going to talk about how to sew a French seam. So first let's talk about what is a French seam. A French seam is a style of seam that's used on a lot of garments. You can also use this seam on other things besides garments, but it is most common in the garment industry. The reason you might want to use a French seam is it fully encloses the seam, which means that it's very, very finished and polished looking on the inside. It also adds a layer of durability because you are double stitching the seam, so it adds a lot of durability there. Now, some challenges for using French seams is if you're using a pattern and the pattern doesn't call for a French seam, you need to think about your seam allowance and what you're doing there in order to incorporate a French seam. It can use a little bit more fabric, but you can also sew it in a way where it's within the seam allowance, but you do have to think about it a little bit more. It can also be really confusing because when you sew things traditionally, you sew things, generally speaking, with the right sides together. When you're doing a French seam, you're going to sew with the wrong sides together, and I'll explain why in just a minute. So since a French seam is basically sewing in a straight line, just in a different way, there's a technique to it, but it is basically sewing in a straight line. I'm not going to show you this technique on my sewing machine because it's basically sewing in a straight line. I'm just going to explain to you the process of how you do this, okay? So first I thought I would show what it looks like on a finished garment. Well, mostly finished. This is not totally finished yet, but it is in process. It's a Beauxbatons dress eventually. I did French seams on the skirt, which is down here. Let me hold this up. So it's right here. So the French seams on the outside look exactly the same as a regular seam, but on the inside, this is what they look like. So as you can see, it's finished. It's got no raw edges are showing. It's completely finished. So that's why you would want a French seam. It means that on the inside, my garment will look completely finished and polished and very professional looking, which is great for competitions. It's also great for durability. So first what you're going to do is decide which seams you're going to do as French seams. I usually do skirts and capes as French seams, the side seams on skirts and capes. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to sew your piece together with the wrong sides together. So it'll look like this. Admittedly, this is muslin, so I know it doesn't have a right side or a wrong side, but this is going to be the right side. This front layer is the right side of my garment, and then this is the wrong side. So you want it to have the seam with your wrong sides together first. So it'll look a little wonky when you sew the first seam because you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, I have this like crazy banana pants thing happening on the right side of my garment, and you're gonna freak out a little bit. It's okay, it's fine, don't panic. So wrong sides together, sew your seam. Now another really important part, you're going to sew that seam and then you're going to trim it. You're going to trim your seam allowance on the seam you just sewed, okay? Step 2 is going to be, you're going to flip it. So this is the right side of my garment, this is the right side. What you're going to do is you're going to flip and enclose it. Just like that. Then you're going to press this. You're going to press it down. You can use an iron, what have you, but you're going to press that. So you are going to sew your seam with your wrong sides together. Then you're going to flip it so the right sides are together. And then you're going to press it. Once you press it, what'll happen is you will sew that seam. And this is what it's going to look like. You're going to have your original seam here. And then from the outside of the garment, this is what it looks like. This is the right side of my garment facing you. And you can see it looks like a regular seam. But on the inside, I have a fully encased seam. Now, important things to note about this are you must trim that seam allowance. You need to trim it in order to make sure that you're fully encasing the seam. So here's an example. If you're going to stay within a 5/8 inch seam allowance, which is pretty common, what you might do is sew your first seam at 2/8 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to sew the second seam at 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you do that, all you need to do is do a quick trim. It doesn't need to be super, super close to the stitching, but a quick trim just to make sure everything's super even and beautiful. And then you're going to flip it, and then you're going to sew it with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. When you do that, it's going to guarantee that all of that first seam allowance is fully encased within the seam, which is super important with a French seam. So if you didn't, and you did it kind of like this, where you just left it super wonky and bulky and crazy, here's what happens to your French seam. it's gonna look like this. You can hopefully see that I've got little pieces of fabric sticking up through the other side. Now, if this happens, it's not the end of the world. You can trim really close to it. You're gonna have a few snaggly threads here and there, but it is not disastrous. The world is not over. However, it is not as professional looking and it's not gonna look as nice as if you had sewn your first seam, trimmed it, pressed it, and then re-sewn it. So just keep that in mind. If you don't do the trimming step and you happen to sew over it, it is not the end of the world. You can just take some small nipping scissors and just go really, really close to the seam and you should be okay, but it's not gonna look as professional. So definitely take the time to go through, sew it at 2/8 inch, do a quick trim, and then sew it at 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then you'll have a perfect French seam. It's gonna be great. So that's all I have for you today, guys. Let me know if you thought that was helpful. Drop me a comment down below if you've ever used a French seam before, or if you have any tips or tricks to make French seams work for you. If you liked what you saw here today, definitely click subscribe so you can see more videos. I put videos out every Tuesday and Thursday. And lastly, if you're looking for more sewing and cosplay tips, come join my free community over on Facebook. It's called Fellowship of the Seam, and I'll have a link in the description bar down below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye!